In motivational interviewing, one of the things we speak about is what we call the spirit of partnership. And it's a really interesting concept to me because I feel like it really highlights the ways in which motivational interviewing has evolved in the years since I first learned it. When I first learned motivational interviewing many years ago, I was taught that it was considered an anti-expert approach, and you may still occasionally hear someone speak about it that way. But to me, anti-expert does not really capture what partnership means. And as we think about work with victims of abuse or violence or harassment or discrimination, I think this comes up quite a bit in our roles as we try to understand what does it really mean to be an advocate? What is our position that we take with the victims with whom we work? So, to me, being partners does not mean that we are against someone having expertise. To me, this means that we are the meeting of two experts. In the case of victim advocacy work, that likely means the advocate has some expertise, and the client, so to speak, or the victim or survivor also comes to the interaction with some expertise. You might say that the victim is the expert in his or her own life, in his or her own values and experiences, his or her own motivations and goals. And the advocate may be an expert in resources and information. And let's face it, as advocates, you get quite a bit of training. And so to pretend like you don't have expertise or that you are not an expert in the room seems inauthentic as well. To me, partners share power in the room. They are collaborative and they work toward a common goal. But to me, this means that we are both experts. We might just take turns sharing our expertise. Now, motivational interviewing offers us a skill called Elicit Provide, Elicit, sometimes shortened to EPE, as a pretty concrete process for how we might exchange some of that expertise between the two partners. So I like to think about this as a 3-step process for exchanging information, which might be helpful in those moments in your advocacy work when perhaps you have a piece of advice you would like to give, but you've been taught over the years that it's not your job to give advice or that it's inappropriate to give advice. And I do support that. I think the best skilled advocates are those who know how to practice some self-restraint and hold some of that back. But let's face it, there are going to be times where you have a piece of information, a suggestion, a recommendation, something you'd like to share, and maybe you've come to a point where you feel like you can't really hold this back anymore. There, I would encourage you to try Elicit, Provide, Elicit. So step 1, you see here my shorthand says C to P. That to me means client to provider. So this is where the expertise will flow from the client to the provider or practitioner or advocate in this case. I tend to use the term provider, but whichever word makes sense for you there. Now, in this case, the provider or advocate would start by asking the client, what do you already know about, and then fill in the blank with whatever it is that you're speaking about. And here you elicit from the client or victim what it is they already know, what's their expertise. You let that survivor be the expert first. So in the phrase elicit, provide, elicit, this first box highlighted in yellow is showing us how we would elicit from the victim or survivor what expertise they come to the table with and respect that they come to us already knowing quite a bit. And before we move on to step 2, we would also ask permission to take that step into step 2 by saying something like, would it be okay with you if I shared what I know? Now you can reword all of this to sound more natural for you, but the point is step 1 is elicit. And here we are just trying to understand from the client to the practitioner what it is that this person comes to us already knowing. And this will help us know where we do not need to give any advice or suggestions because we have someone sitting in front of us who already has that information. Now, assuming that this person has given you permission, you would then move to step 2. Step 2, you see that the lingo has changed a little bit here. It says P to C. Now we have gotten permission to offer some information or perhaps a suggestion. You might use the term advice here, although when I work with advocates, they tend not to like the word advice. So use whatever word makes sense for you here. But P to C represents the practitioner is now going to give some information to the client. So here's where, if I were the advocate, I might say something like, well, some people find, and then fill in the blank for whatever would be relevant for the topic at hand. With that, you can move into step 3, which changes the direction one more time. So if you recall, step 1, the information was flowing from the victim to the advocate, or in my lingo, from the client to the provider. In step 2, the information was flowing from the provider to the client. And now we're going to switch it back one more time. And here I'm going to ask the provider or advocate, again, whichever term you like to use, to ask the client, what do you think about that? Or what's your reaction to that? Or how interested would you be in that? Essentially, we're trying to re-engage this person with the conversation to get some feedback from them about what we said. So here's a more specific example. We might begin with step 1 by asking the victim or survivor, what do you already know about symptoms of trauma? And here we let the victim or survivor teach us. Let this person be the expert first. Let's not assume that they need the information that we have. And we hear from this person, and listen, best case scenario, we end the whole thing there. We don't continue on to provide and elicit again. We find out that this person who we're working with has so much expertise that we can just hear what they know and say, wow, you already know quite a bit about trauma, and just move on to something else. But many times you'll find that someone knows a little bit, 1 or 2 things, and you might like to add to that. So then we move on to asking permission. Would it be okay with you if I added something to what you've already said? And if this person gives us permission, we can move to step 2, provide. And here's where I might say something like, well, some people find that they have difficulty concentrating following a really difficult event or a period of time. And quickly then, moving into step 3, elicit again. Now, what have you heard about that, if anything? Or you might say something like, what's your reaction to that? What do you think about what I said? How do you think you might use what I said? Any of those things would be a way of eliciting from your client or victim or survivor what their reaction is to what you said. And here we keep the information going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It changes the whole paradigm from a one-directional, I am the expert and I will give information to you, the client, to a bi-directional interaction that keeps us passing the microphone between us. I just want to share a couple of final points about this. I find that Elicit Provide Elicit is a nice 3-step process for sharing resources. You might ask a client, for example, what resources are you already aware of that are at your fingertips or in your community? And where you find out that they may lack some information, you could ask permission to give some more. Maybe you'd like to offer something that exists in the research or literature. Maybe you want to give a piece of feedback or a gentle correction of a myth or a misconception that the client has. Elicit Provide Elicit is a nice structured way of doing that. Now, I'd also like you to consider what you might experience if someone says no when you ask permission to give some advice or some information. I find that when I'm working with someone and we have a good rapport going, that maybe some trust has been established, that the fact of the matter is people are unlikely to say no, but they have every right to. And it's my job to respect that. Now, you might be thinking, and this occurs a lot when I give workshops on this topic, people say to me, but Kate, there are some things that I have to say. There are some things that I have to tell them. And what happens if they say no to me? What should I do in that situation? To that, I would say, if a person has told you no, especially someone who has been victimized already, it is crucial that we respect that boundary. that you are likely working with someone who has already tried to say no at some point in their life, and another person has crossed that line and has violated that request. And you cannot, as the advocate, be yet another person to do that. So it is crucial to respect it when someone says, no, I'm not interested. I don't want that information. I don't want your advice, and I don't want your suggestions. Now, if you, as the advocate, feel that there's something you must say to this person, that it's non-negotiable, that you wouldn't be able to sleep tonight if you didn't tell them, I would encourage you then to not ask permission, because in that case, you are running the risk that you might just violate it. So for example, in my work, I have a very short list of things that I would consider, a must say, something I must say to my client. But one of them would be something like, if you tell me that you're going to hurt yourself or someone else, there's a procedure that I must follow. There's something that I must do. There are steps that I must take, and I want to tell you about those. Now, very often, if I'm at the point of using Elicit Provide Elicit, many of those conversations have already been had. They're sort of out of the way, so to speak. But if it needs to be said again, if I need to revisit that conversation, I won't ask permission to do that. Because if someone tells me no, that really puts me in a pickle. So I try very hard to consider in advance, what are the things that I'm willing to ask permission to say, and what are the things that I'm just going to say because they must be said. And I would advocate that you spend some time thinking about the difference between those things. I often say to people who attend my trainings, this is sort of a take-home, go home and make a list of the things that you feel are crucial to say, that you cannot leave unsaid, and then put it aside, sleep on it, maybe give it a week or so, and then revisit that list and ask yourself again with a healthy dose of honesty, how many of these things truly must be said versus how many of them do I just believe must be said? And there is a difference. I have a lot of providers, especially from healthcare, who will tell me from time to time, oh no, I have to tell patients this. And then when I really dig and I pry around that particular topic area, I find that it's really just the provider has a particular sensitivity to maybe a health concern, that it isn't really something they have to say. It's something they believe they have to say. So I ask you to really take an honest look at that. There's unlikely to be a long list of things that go on your must-say list. For me, it's maybe 2 things. And for you, maybe it'll be 2 or 3 things. But if your list turns into 10 or 15 things, I think it's worth really taking a look at that again. Then finally, on my points list here, I have, people often ask me, well, how much information should I give? Now, if you're going to ask permission and say something like, would it be okay with you if I told you something else about resources in the neighborhood? What you may be implying with your language is that you are offering one thing. And when someone consents to that, they have consented to hear one thing. And so it isn't fair and it isn't right to then get on a soapbox and for 30 minutes start talking about everything you know on this subject. Very often, I encourage people to just say one thing when you've been given permission to share a piece of information or a suggestion. You can always circle back and do this again. The Elicit Provide Elicit is set up as a 3-step process, but you could always turn it into Elicit Provide, Elicit Provide, Elicit Provide, Elicit Provide. I'm comfortable with that. What I'm not comfortable with is elicit and then 45 minutes of provide before you elicit again. So I'd ask you to consider keeping that provide step always very short and quickly moving back into elicit so that you don't set your client or victim or survivor in a passive listening role. You keep them very much engaged by eliciting very quickly again. I'd just like to leave you with this saying on the left here. And as you're reviewing that, I will also point you to the right where you'll see my email address, my website, and my Twitter handle. I encourage you to stay in touch with me, send any questions you may have, and I'd be happy to set up any sort of training or workshop or anything that may be helpful for you. Please stay in touch. Thank you.